Normally, I'd be doing this sixth grade art class on ancient China and its culture in your classroom, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. So I'm fortunate to be here today in the Amador County Arts Council offices here in Jackson, and Aaron and Jake are going to be filming me, and they are from KVGC. And this live stream will be on their Facebook website and also on Amador Arts Council's website. And eventually, I think the district is going to pick it up as well. So, as sixth graders, you've seen me come into your classrooms here and there throughout the district. And so today, I'm sort of going to condense down what normally would be a 2-3 hour class, 2-3 hour classes, down to hopefully about an hour. But let's start with some of the things that I have out here on the table. First of all, I was able to go to China about 5 years ago. My wife didn't want to go, but it was something that I had wanted to do all my life. So I had the opportunity, left my poor wife back in Sutter Creek, and we went off to China I went off with my sister and spent 14 days traveling all over China and learning all about the culture. It was absolutely fantastic. If you ever get an opportunity to go to another country and explore its culture, do a little homework before you go. When this first started, I said to you, Ni hao, which means in Chinese, hello. Very simple, words to learn. Ni hao. Another one I said was wo jiao, which means my name is. There are other sayings like zhao zheng hao, which means good morning. And one of the neatest ones that I think that you could learn is something that you can use if you go with your folks or yourself to a Chinese restaurant. Most restaurants serving Chinese food are run by traditional Chinese people. And a way to say thank you for the meal is "谢谢你," which means thank you. And it's amazing when you have an opportunity to speak someone else's language, how much that means to them. Because it's like you took the time to find out something about them and about their culture. So the next time you go to a Chinese restaurant and you are served your meal, remember, it's just simply 谢谢. That's the shortened version. But you could say 谢谢你, which is a more formal way of saying thank you. Okay, so one of the things I learned when I first went was that they dress in many different styles. Now when you go to China, everybody dresses sort of in Western clothes. But back in ancient times, in times past, they dressed in many different kinds of costumes, what we would call costumes, but many different kinds of clothes. What I'm wearing today is a Mandarin coat that would have been worn probably 100, 150 years ago in the imperial court in Beijing. It is made entirely of silk and silk thread, and it comes down to just below my knees a little bit to the middle of my calf. It has the slit up the middle, so it makes it very easy to move. What they would wear underneath it would be a pair of silk pants. These just happen to be black, which is probably what was worn underneath this. And this would be a very formal wear. So perhaps a diplomat or someone, main servant in the Forbidden City in China, in Beijing, which was the palace of the emperor. It has very long sleeves. And the reason for that is that you could, because it gets very cold in Beijing in the winter, you could tuck your arms in like this and keep your hands and your arms warm while you were going about your business. Then when you got somewhere and you needed your hands and your arms, you just simply took them out like that. So imagine it's sort of like a muff that you can stick your arms and hands into. With this, they would probably be wearing a hat similar to this. And I'm going to put this on. This would be the traditional hat that would go along with the Mandarin costume. One thing though, and I found this after I got home, is that never would the hat actually be yellow. The hat, only the emperor could wear yellow. So if you were caught wearing anything yellow, you could be put to death. So this hat is basically just for the tourists. One of the other things it has on it is this long attached braid of what is supposed to be hair. Now this was just sold in a tourist shop for the tourists, but the ancient Chinese, or for example the ones that wore this about 150 years ago, they braided their hair in these long, long tails. And the longer the tail, then the more distinguished you were. And when foreign people, foreign armies would come into China to raid China and all, if they got a hold of an official with a queue, this was called a queue, one of the first things they did was they cut it off. And that was a terrible insult for you to have your queue cut off. So that's why it's there. And again, it's sold as a tourist trinket. One of the things you don't want to do, though, back in those days, would have been to wear yellow. Another hat, probably someone of lesser prestige in the imperial palace, would have worn a hat like this. Fits nice and snug. This one has really pretty silk on it. It is kind of hard because it's made out of like paper mache rather than true silk. The silk is actually not painted on, but glued onto it. So they would wear one like this. Or, whoops, you'd have one finally like this. This one I like. It's red on the inside and it's black everywhere else, just plain black silk, and it has the tassel. And again, it just fits over the crown of your head. This one, because I have such a big head, doesn't really fit me that well. Now, as we traveled through China, we visited several towns and cities. Beijing has about 22 to 23 million people living in the city, what is designated the city of Beijing, which is their capital. We traveled to Xi'an, we traveled to Suzhou, and to Shanghai. And those are smaller cities, except for Shanghai, which is enormous. But the smallest city we went to had 8 million people in it. And one of the day we were in one of the lesser cities with only about 11 million people in it. And we took a drive and we went around a beautiful lake. And I have never seen so many cars, fancy cars, in my life, even in cities like San Francisco or Los Angeles. I must have seen at least 8 Rolls Royces, Bentleys, Maseratis, and I'm thinking, you know, this is supposed to be communist China where everybody is sort of equal and nobody really, you know, is better than anybody else. But I'll tell you, I have never seen such wealth as we saw in China. And as we were going around the lake, very well-dressed people, most of the people dress in Western garb. There are some Chinese, the older people will dress more conservatively. but most of the Chinese we saw were dressed in Western dresses or t-shirts. The young are very fashionable. And as we were driving around the lake, we went into a roundabout, which is those circles like you have out in Plymouth, and we went off to the left, and I would say in less than a mile, we were in a very narrow valley, and lining the sides were terraces of these beautiful green bushes. And it must have gone up about 1,000 feet up this hillside in this narrow valley. And I wondered what were all of these bushes? And then it dawned on me, this was a tea plantation. And as we drove up to one of the factories where they process the tea, I noticed that walking among those bushes, because the bushes are all about probably up to my neck, they're huge, were gentlemen and ladies wearing this type of hat. Okay, looks like this. And they had it on their heads. And this tells you immediately, if you're really paying attention, it tells you something about the weather there. Number one, this is shaped almost like an umbrella. So the tea needs a lot of water to grow. So it rains a lot in this little valley, and the workers wear these hats. And basically, the water comes down, runs right off. When it's sunny, it also keeps the sun off of your head, allows you to work with your hands because you're not holding on to your hat. If the wind comes up, you got this chin strap underneath. And I thought, wow, that's really, really cool. Except I know that when I was a teacher and we'd be out in the yard and you would all put on your ball caps. And if it was a hot day, you came back into the classroom and your hair was all plastered down and you were sweating. Not so in China, because they came up with a wonderful invention. It's right here. This little piece here raises the hat up off of your forehead and makes it so that the hat sits right up on top. That way the breezes can come through and keep you cool. Here's an example, another example of a hat like that. And you can really see it here, where this would have not fit someone's head. It's very, very tiny, but it sits up on top of the crown of their head. And these two would be where you would attach the string to go around your chin. So this one would sit way up like this. And then it would have the two pieces of string coming down here and tying under your chin. Now, it keeps the rain off, keeps the sun off, keeps your hands free, but you're not having this way down here around your brow so that you sweat. You get the nice breezes, you get shelter from the sun and the rain. It works beautifully. Really neat Chinese invention. So those were the hats. Here's a couple of other hats. Now, we didn't see hats like this being worn by people because these hats are worn more in the very southern part of China, down close to Southeast Asia. These hats are much simpler. They would have been worn in the rice paddies. But again, it's the conical shape to keep the sun off, but to keep the rain off as well. And they just these just sit down on their heads, but it doesn't, grip your head. You keep it on using the tie. This one, same thing. Although this has a little indentation here where it would fit on the top of your head like that and keep it way off of your brow so you wouldn't sweat. Very ingenious of the Chinese. Now, speaking of ingenious, I'd like you to look up here because these are all Chinese inventions. A lot of times we think that Europeans invented so many wonderful things, and we don't realize that a lot of inventions and things that were invented that we use today were not developed or invented by Europeans. They were invented by other cultures. And China, for example, it invented the iron-bladed plow. Now you would think, oh, what's that? The plow is one of those things that you see in the old westerns where the farmer is behind the two oxen and he's holding on for dear life and it's going through the dirt. And what it did is it plowed a furrow or a row of dirt up so that he could plant his seeds and then cover them up and grow his crops. Except that early plows invented by the Europeans all were made out of wood. So you hit a big rock, the wood would break, the wooden plow, and you were out of business or commission until you could build another plow piece to put on the end. The Chinese solved that by making it out of iron. So when it hit a rock, it either cracked the rock or it went right over it. And they could plow longer during the day because they didn't have all these mishaps, and they could grow more food. More food meant larger populations. Larger populations mean that you can do a lot more. Another invention was the abacus, probably one of the first examples of a computer. And you've all seen an abacus. Has the little bars on it with the little colored beads. And if you ever go into a store in Chinatown in San Francisco and they're adding up your bill, sometimes they use an abacus and they just keep moving the colored beads back and forth, and they're actually multiplying, adding, dividing, doing all sorts of things on that abacus. So the Chinese turned out to be very good businessmen. And they also invented the wheelbarrow. Yeah, so what? You invent a wheelbarrow. However, with that iron-bladed plow, you can really plow the fields. You can grow an awful lot of food. But once you've harvested that food, how are you going to get it from your barn or wherever you processed it to the wagon so that it can be hauled away? You have to carry it on the backs of men. That takes a long time. Everybody gets a sack of vegetables and carries it over and puts it in the wagon. But with a wheelbarrow, you can put 5 or 6 bags of the produce in the wheelbarrow, wheel it over, and just toss it into the wagon. It made work a lot easier. One of their inventions was also inventing gunpowder, powder that would actually explode. Now, Western civilizations used it for nefarious purposes, such as in guns and cannons and stuff. But when it was first invented in China, it was for fireworks that would be done on special occasions, ceremonies, the emperor's birthday. They would shoot off these beautiful fireworks, even in ancient times. And that's what the gunpowder was used for, not for guns and cannons. Noodles. A lot of people think that if you go to Italy in Western Europe, that you are going to get spaghetti. If you go to Italy, you got to get spaghetti. You got to get noodles. You got to get spaghetti noodles and macaroni noodles and all of this. It was not invented by the Italians. In the 1600s, Marco Polo and his father and his uncle, who were Genoese, and they left from the town, the city, the port city of Genoa, and they traveled the Silk Road all the way to China. And one of the things they brought back were noodles from the Chinese. They always ate noodles. The Italians brought them back, Marco Polo and his family, and that's how the noodles got to be in Italy. And that's how you get spaghetti, but it came originally from China. The next thing they had was porcelain. Now, in Western Europe, they had teapots and cups and other vessels, bowls and things that they made out of clay and fired. But the clay was heavy. It was not decorated necessarily beautifully. But the Chinese developed a way of using the clay and making it very thin, to the point where, and I don't have really any today, but to the point where you could actually put your fingers in it and see through the porcelain. So fine porcelain was, or China was one of their inventions. Lastly, silk, like the robe I'm wearing. And all this embroidery on this robe was hand done. So someone spent hours embroidering this robe. And if you look on the back, you can see the dragon that is part of the design. Now, China had a monopoly on silk. And they guarded it very carefully because they did not want anyone else to be able to make silk. If they had the monopoly on it, they could charge whatever they wanted. And people throughout the world, once they started trading with China, wanted silk. Now, this robe would have been for a young girl. I'll hold it up. And it is made out of silk. And the embroidery on this silk robe was done by a machine. It was not hand done. But it's still absolutely beautiful. It does have the dragons on it, as you can see. Now, silk is a wonderful product because in the winter, it keeps you warm, and in the summer, it keeps you cold. It's insulation, basically. And where does it come? It's not something that is grown like cotton is grown in a field. Silk comes from the silkworm. And the Chinese discovered how to create silk and get the silk from the silkworm. If you go to China today, there are large factories that actually make silk. We were able to visit one, and as you walked in, you had enormous bamboo trays, probably about this wide and twice as long. In these trays, which were only about that high, were scattered leaves. And the leaves are mulberry leaves, because that's the only thing that the Chinese silkworm will eat. It doesn't like any other kind of leaves. It only likes the mulberry leaves. So the mulberry leaves are spread in these low baskets, and then the worms are put in. Now, the worms are just like caterpillars. They're not worms that go in the ground. These are like caterpillars. And when they finally mature and grow up, it becomes a moth. But we are only interested in the silkworm, the actual worm. So they gobble up all of the mulberry leaves in this big container, and then at a certain period of time, they start to form a cocoon, just like a butterfly or a moth would. The cocoon is actually white. And so workers will come in, and they will start picking little white, rounded, sort of oblong balls out of these baskets. And they're basically, and what they are, the cocoon of the silkworm. They carry them in large baskets into another room. And here it was absolutely fascinating because there was a trough of boiling water. And the worms, or the cocoons, now they were cocoons, they were no longer worms. The cocoons were dumped into the boiling water. And they're sort of bouncing around in the boiling water, and then they become still because the boiling water would kill the worm inside. Now you have to remember, if you harvested all of the silkworms and put them in the boiling water to kill them so you could use the cocoon thread, you wouldn't have any more silkworms. So as they have big baskets of the silkworms that they put into the boiling water, they also have big baskets that they take out so that those silkworms can hatch from their cocoons and actually become the moth that produces more silkworms. But anyway, here's this long trough, all of these little white cocoons bouncing around in that hot water, and they have workers there. Probably in the United States, you would never be allowed to get this close, but they let the tourists come in. And if this was the trough, I mean, I could stand right here and watch the person standing here. And they dip their hands in, but they dip them in very fast because the water's very hot. And they're grabbing at the cocoons. And pretty soon they pull something up, and they hold it in their fingers like this, and then they start getting another one, which they pull up like this. And it's like they're doing a magic show because you cannot see what they have in their fingers. It's like, I mean, I'm right there looking at it, and I cannot see for the life of me what they are holding in their fingers. But what they've done is they've turned the cocoon around until they find the end of the cocoon thread. And they're pulling the thread. And as they pull up on the thread, the cocoon down here in the water starts to spin. And after they put together maybe 10 or 20 of these bobbing cocoon threads, you finally get to a point where you can actually see the thread. And when they do that, they wrap it around a bobbin, which is just a little piece of wood that's sits on a pole, and it turns and spins. And what it starts doing is collecting the silk thread from the cocoons. And you look down, now here are all 20 of those cocoons just bobbing around in the water because they're being unstrung. The bobbin is turning around and it's just pulling up all of those silk threads and going around the bobbin. Absolutely fascinating. Once that is done, then the bobbin is taken somewhere else and processed, and it is turned into one single thread, very, very long. And one of the things that amazed me is that they told us that one cocoon could have over a mile of thread in each cocoon. So that cocoon is just being wrapped around and around and around. But of course it takes like 20 of the cocoons to make one long continuous thread that can be used to make silk cloth and the silk embroidery thread. Absolutely fascinating that they would have that. Now, going back to the tea plantation, when the bus stopped, the tourist bus, all the tourists get out with their cameras and everything, and we go inside to a big room, and they explain to us the process of growing the tea. Now, back in ancient times, when the emperor was the ruler of China, what they did is they had what is known as the dragon's tea. That was each harvest season, the first leaves off of the bushes were for the emperor. Nobody else could have that tea. Wherever the tea plantations were in China, the first tea off of the bushes was picked and it was sent immediately to the imperial palace, and it was only for the emperor and his court, and it was called dragon's tea. And the people brought out, this is kind of a small packet, they had one much bigger, it was about this size, and it was made of paper, and they unfolded it. And unfortunately, remember I said I went 5 years ago to China, so this is not the dragon's tea. This is some other loose tea that I had. And they unfolded it, and they put the tea in the center of the table. And they explained that this was dragon's tea because it was the first harvest of the tea plants for that year, and that made it extra special. And of course they wanted the tourists to buy the tea. My sister and I thought, well, sure, we'll buy some tea. We're not real tea drinkers. We drink coffee more often than we drink tea, but we do like tea occasionally. So we said, yeah, we'll split one of those. Now we're thinking Lipton's tea comes in a tea bag, and you buy it in the store for, $3.50 for a box of maybe 50 tea bags. When we got to the end of the demonstration and all, and we had raised our hands to say, yes, we'll buy one of the packets of tea, it came to $100 for the dragon's tea. Thank heaven I went in on it with my sister, so we each only paid 50. They took the tea from the packet, and they put it into canisters, little cans, and we each got one big can, 2 small cans, and that was about it when they split it all up. Excuse me. And that was $50 worth. So I'm so glad that I didn't say I would take the whole packet. I was able to split that with my sister. Now, the tea in China, they do not use the Lipton-like tea bags that we have here in the United States. They always brew it loose. And so they would just take the loose tea like this and put it into the pot, brew it, and then they would drink it. But the funny thing is that the green tea that they grow in China, long, thin little pieces of leaves, and it brews a delicious cup of tea. But they don't strain it at all. So when they pour it into your cup, you get tea leaves all through it. Now you can't see this, but there are tea leaves at the bottom. And the Chinese don't waste anything, so they would drink down the tea and they would chew the leaves. And it's just like, to me, it reminded me of having a wad of tobacco, people that chew tobacco, because they're constantly chewing on something. And I thought maybe the Chinese people, before we went to the tea plantation, I thought the Chinese people were chewing gum. But they weren't. They were chewing the tea leaves. You get lots of antioxidants. It's very good for you. It's not like chewing tobacco, which is bad for you. Chewing the tea leaves is very, very good. I also noticed that everywhere we went in China, there are so many people, but all of the people, from the little kids up to adults, up to older people, have on their hip a water bottle. Now you'd think, wow, very healthy. They're all constantly staying hydrated and drinking water, but it's not water. It is green tea. And mixed in that green tea, of course, are the leaves. So they get thirsty, they take out their tea, they take a big swig like we would take a swig of water. They get the tea leaves in their mouth, put the water bottle back on their belt, and go about their business. After they've drank the water or the tea, they still have the leaves in their mouth, so they're constantly chewing. It was amazing to watch people, because you really didn't, at first you thought they were all chewing gum, but you never saw any gum on the sidewalk, and you never saw any, gum sold in stores. It was the tea leaves, the green tea leaves. Keeps the Chinese people healthy. Now, these are some of the items that I have here. One of the other things, too, is the ancient way that the Chinese did their business. They did it with handwriting. a lot. Everything had to be hand copied. They did have printing presses long before Western civilization had printing presses. They could actually print out books and everything, but they had what we know as characters. For example, this character here is the Chinese character for love. And they have these characters, but in order to print a book using these characters, you would have to know over 3,500, that's 3,500 characters in order to be able to write down what they wanted to say. We only have 26 characters in our alphabet. It's real easy to learn A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, and on through to Z. It's very easy for us to do that and then combine those characters to make words. But the Chinese have over 3,500 characters. So when you're combining all of those different characters into words, it's very difficult, number one, to read, and also very difficult to write. So they did not use their printing to write books, but they did use their brushes like this. And back in the old days, they had, whereas we might have our phones, they had little tubs like this. Chinese love to put things in boxes. So they are very good at putting things, small things, in boxes. So if you were an ancient Chinese and you went to school, you learned things, you would probably have something like this. Now, this was their ancient way of writing. What it has here is a stone like this. The stone is put in here. You have a little dish. This dish would be filled with water. You have a little spoon like this, and you would spoon out very carefully the water into the stone. And you can't see it from there, but the stone is not entirely flat inside. At one end it dips down, so it forms a little well where you could put water. Then you would use your brushes to dip in the water, but first, and I'm hoping that I have it in this one, yes, you would have your ink. Now here's the ink. Usually on one side they would put beautiful decorations or scenes, and on the other side they would have characters they're writing. Now the ink is made from cow dung and charcoal. Doesn't smell. It won't get all over your hands when it's like this. It's solid piece of ink. But if you dip this into the water and rub it on the stone, then it dissolves and it creates the ink, which you then use your brushes to dip in and to write on paper. Now, once you have written on your paper, maybe it's an official document, maybe you did a poem, maybe you created a beautiful painting like this brush painting back here. Once that has been done, then you have to sign it. But instead of signing it with characters that would pronounce your name, like Peccianti, what they would do is you would have a chop. And the chop was carried in little boxes, and it was a stone like this. And oftentimes the stones were made out of jade or some other hard stone. They were beautifully carved and decorated, but the important part is on the bottom. That is the chop. And it's like your ancient version of a credit card. If you were buying a house in ancient China, they would write up the deed. You would pay promised to pay them for, 10 years or so. You'd pay $500 a month or whatever, like we do today. And they would take your chop and put it on the paper. That made it official. You promised to pay them back. If you didn't, you would be in serious trouble. So you never wanted to lose your chop. If you lost your chop and someone else got a hold of it, they could go around town, borrowing money, doing all sorts of things and putting your chop on something that they wanted, and you would be held responsible. All the chops were registered with the government, so they knew, you had bought it. And if it was lost or stolen, that was your problem. Now, this one is actually my chop that I had made for me in Beijing. It has an ox, beautiful carved ox up here at the top. And on the bottom, it has a carving. And if I stamped it, then this is what it would come out to look like. Okay? So the bottom of this is this, and this is my chop. I didn't want my name because if you're a tourist, what they'll do is they'll put your first name, like George or Joe. They'll write it, and then they'll put what it looks like in Chinese. And I did not want that. What my chop says is the word joy, J-O-Y. And so I have it here. Now, whenever I do a piece of artwork or something, then I stamp this and it is stamped on the artwork. Right here is a chop of the person who painted this picture. Now, included in your little kit here is the actual ink that you use to chop. It's usually red, but this stuff is really gooey and ooey, and I prefer to use just a red or a black stamp pad once I got back to America. Okay. Now, if I ever get an opportunity to come into the 6th grades next year, we will actually have an opportunity to make our own chops. For example, this is one. This is foam board, and it was actually carved out with a design. And once it's carved out and stamped, it comes like this. So kids were able to make their own chops. We don't have the ability to do that in a televised lesson, so we won't be doing that today. Okay. Now, all of these wonderful artifacts and everything pale in comparison when you start learning about the history of China. And let's go to our next chart, which shows the ancient kingdoms of China. Now we're going back in time to 259 years before the birth of Christ. So it's now called BCE, or before the Common Era. We're going back 259 years before that. So if you add 2020, which is what year we are in now, plus the 259, we're looking at 2,279 years ago. Long, long time. And this is what ancient China looked like then. It was divided into several kingdoms. Each kingdom had a king, a queen, and they ruled their area of China. Now, it's hard to see when you look at an old map like this of China. The United States of America would actually fit inside right here. From coast to coast, the United States would fit inside China and still have room on the top and the bottom. That's how big a country China is. And back in those days, there were the Qin, the Zhao, the Yan, Qi, the Wei, the Han, and the Chu. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different kingdoms. Now, all of those kingdoms ruled a certain area of ancient China. But we're going to be talking about this this kingdom here, the kingdom of Qin. There was a ruler there, and the parents were Lady Zhao and King Zhuangxiang of Qin. And they ruled this area in the western part of ancient China. Suddenly one day, the king drops dead, and Lady Zhao is left, and she has a young son. Now, the young son is not of age to take over from his father. He is still a little boy. So, Lady Zhao, she decides she needs a prime minister, someone to help her. So she finds a charming gentleman and makes him prime minister, and together Lady Zhao and the prime minister rule the country. She doesn't want any interference from her son, so she tucks him away in a beautiful palace, gives him everything he wants, and lets him just frivol away his time. Well, as he gets older, he decides, I'm just sitting over here doing nothing. I have a wonderful wife. I can do anything I want, but I'm not really ruling the country. My mother is, and I don't really like the job she's doing. So what does he do? He rises up, he gets followers behind him, and he raids the palace where his mother and the prime minister are. He arrests his mother, sends her off to a castle far, far away. The prime minister, he tortures to death, and he makes himself king. So he is now king of Qin. And he looks out over the rest of China and he goes, well, that was fairly easy. I'm ruler now. I can do whatever I want. And if it was that easy, I think I may take some of these other states as well. Now, the first thing I ask kids when we get to this point is, if you were going to take over these other states, do you declare war on all of them at the same time? No, that wouldn't be very smart, because if you said, I'm going to, attack all of you and you better surrender right now, they'd laugh at you. If you really did have a good army and you attacked Zhao, well, maybe Zhao and Yan and Qi would get together and they would fight you, and now you've got 3 countries, 3 kingdoms attacking just one. It's not going to work out. So what he did, Shi Huang, which is what his name was, Shi Huang, what Shi Huang did was he decided, I'm only going to pick one off at a time. So he declared war on the kingdom of Wei, which was right next door. Very, very easy. I'll just go in. I'm going to only attack this kingdom. Now, when you do that, how does a country win a war? Usually they win a war because they've got a lot of people, or they have the biggest guns. Now, as I told you before, the Chinese were not using that gunpowder to make cannons or rifles or those kinds of weapons at this time. They did it later in their history, but not then. So Shi Huang decides, we all have the same weapons, so it's just going to be my army versus their army. Yeah, mine are more disciplined and all, but I need better weapons. So he set about making some better weapons. Now I'll go back to that map in just a second. With this chart, so Zhao Zheng, who is the king of Qinao, Zhao Zheng was born in 259 BC. And he became king at 13 in 247 BC. That's when his dad died. And he went for 9 more years enjoying life before he finally took over the kingdom of Qin and ousted his mother and the prime minister. So he's 22 years old when he takes over the country. Okay. Now, he's declared war, but he wants to have some better weapons than the opposition. So he comes up with this ingenious longbow. Other kingdoms in China had the longbow, but it was really hard to pull it back. Your archers had to be extremely strong to pull it back. And then they didn't aim straight at the enemy. What they did is they aimed up into the air and they let their arrow go. And what it would do is the arrows would fly up and then they would come down just like raindrops. And imagine, thousands of arrows coming down on your head. It was horrible. People, soldiers died extremely terrible deaths with these rains of arrows coming down on them. The problem was that with those big bows, you had to be fairly close to the enemy. So I have long bows, you have long bows. We each have to be maybe 100 yards apart from one another in order for the arrows to reach the enemy. What Shi Huang did is he came up with this long bow. He took the long bow part, carved a niche out of it, and put in this wooden piece here. Then he put together a trigger system. Now, where the bow could only be stretched maybe this far, now the bow with this triggering system, the archer takes the bow like this, puts his foot on it, and pulls it so that the string goes over this little clip right here. Now, instead of the bow being pulled back this far, the bow can be pulled back that far. The further back the bow goes, the farther the arrow goes. So here comes the opposing army. And it's got to get within 100 yards of Shi Huang's army before they can release their arrows. Otherwise, the arrows will fall short. Well, they get to about maybe 150 yards from Shi Huang's army, and his archers let loose with that rain of arrows coming down. But now he can go with his arrows 150 yards. So before the other army can even shoot their arrows, they have this enormous rain of arrows coming down on them. And they know if they fire back, it won't even hit his army because they can't pull their arrows back as far. An amazing, amazing device. Just something as simple as perfecting that longbow. Now, he didn't stop there. He realized that these are made out of iron. Iron has a tendency under stress to break. If that little trigger mechanism breaks, then that longbow is out of commission and nobody can fire it anymore. So he decides, what I'll do is I will standardize that trigger device. And by standardization, what he does is he makes thousands of this little iron trigger system, so that if it breaks, he's got runners, usually young boys, running up and down the archery line with baskets full of these little trigger things. An archer raises his hand, the boy runs over, hands him a trigger, and bingo, the trigger is popped out, another one is put in, and the archer is back in business. Amazing. He even had extra ones of these made, the long part, the wooden part, because sometimes when you're bending that back, that would break because it's made of wood. But this piece could be taken out and a new piece put in. Now, he didn't stop there. The other amazing thing that he did is that he standardized these triggers so that one trigger fit all of the bows. But then he had the person who was making the triggers sign their chop on the trigger. Each trigger had two chops. It had one by the person who actually made the chop or made the trigger, and it had another chop by his supervisor. Now imagine what happens after the battle, after Shi Wang has completely annihilated the army of his opponent. All those boys go around and they pick up all the broken triggers and they take them back and they put, let's just use American names, they put all of Sam's broken triggers in this pile and they put all of Joe's broken triggers in this pile. And they notice that Sam only had 4 broken triggers. But in this pile, Sam, he had 30 broken triggers, which means that Joe is doing a good job. Sam is not doing too good. Immediately, Sam is thrown into prison, but also Sam's supervisor, who should have been checking his triggers to make sure they worked, he is thrown in prison as well. Now, normally you just think, they'd get the axe, but Shi Wang had other plans. So Sam and his supervisor are put in prison. Joe is promoted to chief trigger maker because his triggers don't break. He does a good job. So they have the longbow. Next, they have this other weapon that he invents. Now, one of the reasons that the United States won the Second World War was because they were the first to develop the atomic bomb, a bigger, better weapon than anybody else had in the entire world. No one else but the United States had the atomic bomb. They dropped that bomb twice. That's the only 2 times the atomic bomb has ever been used. It was in World War II, and it was dropped twice. And it killed hundreds of thousands of people in the blink of an eye. The reason they won the war was because they had the biggest and the best weapon. So Shi Wangdi goes out and he orders another new weapon, and this is called the halberds. This is about 15 feet long, 12 to 15 feet long, has an iron point at the end, and then he added something to it. This very sharp blade comes through about that far down on the spear. These are the infantry, have these weapons. The archers are first. They shoot the arrows rain down on the enemy. When the enemy finally does stagger close enough to where they can shoot their arrows, they are decimated. So the enemy brings in the cavalry. The cavalry starts charging. They're on horseback. They have their sword in one hand, they might have a spear or a dagger in the other, and the horses are charging the lines of the enemy. The infantry marches out in a solid line, and maybe 20 yards ahead comes the charging cavalry of the enemy, and suddenly the infantry takes a stance, takes that spear, drives it, the butt end, into the ground, and lowers it at an angle. The cavalry is going too fast to slow down. They can't stop their horses in time, and the horses are impaled on these terrible spears. Now, the reason for this cross piece here, though, is if the horses are going at full gallop and they run into those terrible spears and are impaled, the spear goes so far into them that the infantryman can't get the spear out. And while he's trying to drag it out of the dead horse, the rider on top of the horse is swooping down with his sword to lop off an arm or a head or whatever. So this piece here stopped the spear from going in too far. It only went in far enough to kill or wound the horse. It made it very easy for the infantryman to then just pull the spear back. He could sweep it like a scythe and chop off the front legs of the horse, or he could go up with it like a scythe. This would hook around the rider, and he could pull the rider off and stab him with the point of the spear. None of the other armies had this. None of them. They didn't know what hit them. Their cavalries were annihilated on the field of battle. Either the crossbow arrows got them, or the halberds destroyed their cavalry. Finally, he had a couple of other things. His swords, all weapons at this time were made of bronze and sharpened on a stone, but all the weapons were standardized. The arrows, the halberds, the longbows, the triggers were standard and interchangeable. And the weapons were signed by craftsmen and workers, so shoddy or faulty work could be traced. The arrowheads were not like we see an Indian or a Native American arrowhead that is just pointed and sharp. They were more like a cone shape. If you were looking straight on at it, it would be like this, which made it even more deadly, made it easier for it, sort of aerodynamic, and could go into a person much easier. And each one of the archers carried 100 arrows in his quiver, which was on his back. So they could just pull it in, shoot it, take one out, pull it in, shoot it. It was just like continuous, sort of like a pistol against a machine gun. So Shi Huangdi attacks the kingdom of Han. Same thing happens. He takes it over. Now Zhao is getting pretty worried, so they're mustering their army and they're going to go fight Shi Huang. Shi Huang annihilates them. Then he goes on to Yan and Qi and takes care of their armies, and their kingdom is swallowed up. By the time he got to Chu, which is way down here in the southern part of China, Chu simply threw their hands up and said, that's enough. We surrender. We don't want our country trampled into the ground. So they become part of the Qin kingdom, or the dynasty that he creates. Now, it doesn't seem like much when you look at this little map here that, he ran over all of these kingdoms. But you have to remember that those kingdoms stretched for thousands of miles. It would be like, back before the birth of Jesus Christ, somebody in California marching out and taking over the whole United States. I mean, how could you do that back then? But that's what Shi Huang did. And he changed his name to Shi Huangdi. And he became the first emperor of China. And he is known today as Shi Huangdi. the first emperor of China. And he was the first one to completely unite all of China. He did that by the time he was 39 years old. Now, of course, once you take over the entire country, you want to be able to enjoy it. So he didn't want to die. So he sent out his minions, his learned men, all over the kingdom and all over the world to find something that would keep him alive forever. Now, they were panicked. They didn't know what to do. They knew there was no such thing as a fountain of youth or something that would keep him alive. So one doctor was brave enough to make up a silver pill. Unfortunately, the pill was made out of mercury. And he told Shi Huangdi that if he took these pills, that it would help him live forever. So he started taking it, and slowly, over the course of a few years, Shi Huangdi poisoned himself to death. But as soon as he took over all of China, he did two amazing things. As soon as he took over, he realized that the kingdoms of Yan and Zhao had started this amazing wall in the northern part of China. And it kept the warring tribes that were north of China out of the country. It was like a protection, sort of like what President Trump thinks that he can do in Mexico by putting up a wall. This wall, however, is much longer than anything the United States is trying to do. This wall actually stretches 3,000 miles. So basically, it goes from Los Angeles to New York. Imagine a wall. The wall is about 30 feet high and about 25 feet wide. And it is relentless. It goes up mountains, up over peaks, down into deep valleys, but it's always the same, 30 feet high, 25 feet wide. And remember poor Sam, who made the faulty trigger, got thrown into prison? Poor Sam is sent to work on the wall in northern China, breaking up stone, building the wall, stone after stone. One day, Sam is down in the pit between the two walls, and they're filling it up with rubble, and they're throwing rocks down into it, and Sam gets hit in the head with a rock and dies. There's no funeral. There's no mourning for poor Sam. They just simply back off, and they throw more rocks on top of Sam, and he's buried in the wall. They say there are over 100,000 skeletons buried in that wall of workers who just simply died. Their bodies were thrown into the wall and covered up. Now, the wall itself is amazing, not only because it's so long, but because of the ingenious way that it was set up. About every half mile, there is a tower. And on that tower, there's a little platform, and there is a big bonfire. They don't light it, they just build it. Then, if they see warriors coming from the other side, and who lived up here were the Moguls, and as they start coming down to attack China, they would light one of these bonfires. Half a mile away, another watchtower says, oh my gosh, they just lighted their bonfire. That means the Moguls are coming. So they light their bonfire, and it's carried along the wall for miles in just a matter of minutes, so that the Chinese can get their army together to go out and fight the Moguls. So the Moguls will thinking that they're sneaking up on them, but they're immediately detected because all the vegetation and everything on both sides of the wall is cut away so you can see them coming. And then they're signaled and they're taken care of immediately. So Shi Huangdi builds this 3,000-mile long wall to protect northern China. But as soon as he became the first emperor, he also started to build his tomb. And that is probably one of the most amazing things. I probably won't live to see it, but maybe you will live to see it. The Chinese people and the Chinese archaeologists know where the tomb is. It's not a problem. They know exactly where it is. It is built outside of Xi'an, which was Shi Huangdi's capital city. And it's a horrendous mountain, a mound. And you can hike to this day, you can hike to the top of it. But the legends are that underneath that mountain of dirt is built his tomb. They say it is the size of 2 or 3 football fields inside, with a ceiling that is maybe 20 stories high. That the entire floor of the tomb is a map of China at the time of Shi Huangdi being the emperor of China, the first emperor. And it is made entirely out of bronze. And all of the oceans and the seas in the country are molded into this topographical map of China. And the seas and the oceans are flowing mercury. And in the very center where his capital city was, of Xi'an, is built an enormous tomb where he lies in state. They say the ceiling is painted with the constellations on the day that he died. And I can only imagine the wealth and everything that must be in that tomb. Now, the Chinese people know that it's there, but they don't go in. They haven't breached it to go inside because they are developing archaeological techniques so that when they go in, they can save the artifacts. Excuse me. Because many things that are that old, you're looking at over 2,500 years old, when they are touched by the outside air, they have a tendency to simply disintegrate. So the Chinese are trying to figure out how they can preserve what is inside that tomb once they do manage to get inside of it. Now, back in 1974, on the outskirts of the tomb, about 5 miles away, a farmer was digging a well. And suddenly he came up with a head like this. Now, the head was actually life-size. He'd never seen anything like it. And he immediately called the universities. They sent out an archaeologist. And what they discovered were the terracotta warriors. Over 1,900 buried terracotta, in other words, they were made out of clay, warriors buried in the earth. That was the army that was supposed to protect Shi Huangdi in the afterlife. Now, they have uncovered 1,900 of them, but they figure that the army is actually more like 8,000 warriors that are still buried between the tomb, which is 5 miles away, and where the terracotta warriors were first discovered. So they figure there's another 5,000 warriors buried in the dirt between the tomb and where they first discovered them. Each one of the warriors is life-size. It weighs about 400 pounds. They are made in several different parts. Each one stands on a pedestal. They make the foot and the leg up to here. Then they have the body. Then they have the arms and the hands. Each one of the terracotta warriors, their hands are formed in a certain way. If you notice, his hands are like this. That's because he was holding a certain weapon. This is probably a general with the type of headdress that he has and this around his neck. So he was probably carrying a sword. Not sure what he was doing with this hand, though. And they have uncovered these, and what you have to realize is that while the bodies, the hands are all the same, except that the different warriors, for example, this is an archer, so his hands are different than these hands because he was holding a bow. So the hands are a little bit different depending on what kind of soldier it was, whether it was infantry or archery. But the bodies are all the same. But they were all hand painted to look absolutely real. So that if an invading army came over the hill and looked down, they would think there's an army, Shi Huangdi has an army out to get us of over 8,000, military personnel. So hopefully it would scare them off. The thing that he did that was so unique, however, is that he took his army, which was at this time obviously about 8,000 soldiers, and he had them run a company at a time through the artisan tents that were there to build his tomb, and each one of the soldiers' faces was sculpted individually. So every single face on those 1,900 warriors that they have discovered was individually sculpted. They noticed that the eyes are not the same. Some are more squinty than others. Some had mustaches or beards. Some had different top knots of their hair. They even did a study on their earlobes and found that no two earlobes on any of those warriors are alike. So they were each one individually hand sculpted. Absolutely amazing. And then they were painted. Now these were actually bought just off site in a museum. And this is the same kind of clay. So if you look at the terracotta warriors today, this is the color that the warriors are. These were also bought at the museum, but they're smaller and they're a different color. And the Chinese love to put everything in a box, so that's why we have all these boxes here. Okay? Beautiful pieces of art. My mother brought this back when she went to China. Now, the pieces were all built separately and then assembled together, and the heads were set down into the body of the torso. My mother kept this in her bedroom, and after she passed away, we were cleaning the house, and I noticed that this was laying on its side, and the head was off somewhere else. I found the head, and I thought my sister had broken it when she was trying to clean and then left it for me to find. And so I glued it, and I did a terrible job of gluing it. But actually, the head was made to come off. And it was put down. I mean, that's the way they're sold. But I didn't find that out until I actually visited China. So imagine 1,900 of these soldiers buried in the ground, all in painted to look real. Their flesh tones, their uniforms were, if you were an archer, you had a certain color and everything to your uniform. All of these are still there. And what they do is they take them where they find them. Many of them were broken from years of having, all that dirt on them. So they take all the pieces and they take them to what they refer to as the hospital. They glue all the pieces back together again, and then they take them back to where they were found, and they set them up in the military formation that they were found in. It's absolutely amazing. Amazing. So, remember, ancient China, first emperor of China was Shi Huangdi. He was from the kingdom of Qin. His capital city of Xi'an, Xian, is right about here on the Wei River. You can still visit it today. You can also visit the terracotta warriors. The one thing you cannot visit is his tomb, because the Chinese have not opened it yet until they have the techniques to be able to preserve what they find inside. So that concludes the art and the history part of it, the artifacts. But now I would like to do the art project that goes with this. Normally, kids would make a chop or they would do a bamboo painting, but that requires ink and brushes and a lot of other things that you don't have at home. So what we're going to do today is we're going to learn about another ancient Chinese tradition. And all of you, I know sixth graders because I used to teach sixth grade, and I know that you can all make this without even thinking. And that is a yin-yang symbol. Looks like this. This is the first thing that you're going to do. You're going to get a piece of paper. Could be anything. Your computer paper out of your printer. Maybe you have some art paper laying around. You just simply get a piece of white paper. And then you're going to find something that you can trace a circle. I discovered that I had this paper plate down in my studio, and if I just put it over it like that, I could trace a perfect circle with it. You might have a bowl or something. Maybe your mom has a bowl that would fit on the paper. Another thing to use, a larger paper plate if you got a bigger piece of paper. An old pie tin, that would work as well. The only thing I suggest is if you're going to use one of your mom's good bowls to make the circle, don't use the marking pen, because you're going to leave a line around your mother's good bowl. So do it in pencil first, then you can put the bowl away and go over it with the marking pens. So the first thing you're going to do is make the circle. And a yin-yang symbol is a symbol, ancient Chinese symbol of balance. It has to do with their culture. That to everything there is a balance. To night there is day. To good there is evil. Everything is in balance. And when everything is in imbalance, the world runs very smoothly. Right now, we're in the COVID-19 crisis, and the world is not running smoothly, and we have a terrible imbalance. So our yin-yang is completely out of whack. Try doing this. Maybe we can all do one of these and put things back together. So what it is it's simply a curved line that comes down and around this side. And I know all of you can do this because I've seen you doodle it on your papers. Notice that it has a circle, though, in the upper part and the lower part. Each part of the yin-yang symbol has that circle. The reason because that is balance. For example, everything isn't all black at nighttime. You have the moon shining, which gives you a little bit of light. Everything isn't always light during the daytime, because sometimes you have really black, stormy clouds that make it look like night. It's the balance between the two. So each part has a little bit of the other part in it in order to keep that balance. So After you've done this part, then you are going to take a marking pen and you're going to go over it with your marker. So now we have the symbol done on here perfectly. What are we going to put in it to do the opposite? In other words, I want you to think of opposites. Good, bad, day, night, in, out, up, down. All of those are opposites. So when I was thinking about it, what I came to my mind was artistically using color and using ink, black and white. So I came up with this one. Here is my yin-yang. Now, if you look at it closely, on this side, it has all the color. And I didn't section off areas for color. I just used, and I know because I've worked with you all since you were in kindergarten, and what I used on this one were the crayon sticks, the art sticks, and we've used those before in all your classes. If you don't have those, no big deal. Use crayons. And as far as the colors go, I'm sure that all of you remember that I'm totally colorblind, so I don't care what colors you use. Use whatever colors make you happy. So I put these colors together, sort of blended them into each other using the color sticks, and I filled up this part of my yin-yang symbol. But because it's not entirely color, it's got to be balanced. It has the circle. So the color went here, and in this circle, I put the doodling. Now, if you've been in the district for, your entire career, you know that back in 2nd grade, I taught you how to doodle. And so what I did is I took a pencil, and I highly recommend you do it first with a pencil. And I did all sorts of little doodles in here. And once I had done my doodles, I took my pen, and you can just use any old ballpoint pen that you have around the house. If you have a Sharpie, fantastic, with a fine tip point. And then I went over my pencil marks with the pen. But I kept it one color. The only part I filled in was a little bit here, but I filled it in the same color that I used the pen. So here is all the doodling in black and white. Here is all the color. The color goes here because in order for it to be perfectly balanced, it has to have a little bit of the other side in it. And over here, this has a little bit of the doodles in it. Don't make your doodles too small, because you go crazy trying to fill it in, even though you do have a lot of time now on your hands. But try and keep it big so people can see your pattern. Then what I did is I signed my name around the curve. Always sign your name to your work. And what I did, because this is a really special time, you're going to remember 2020 when you're old and gray. I put the date. Now, the only other thing that you might want to do is to write the opposites in neat printing down here on your artwork. Or you could do it on the back, such as night and day, good and evil, black and white, anything that's an opposite. See how many you can come up with. So this is going to be your art lesson. And hopefully, for any 5th graders who are watching, next year when I do this lesson for you in 6th grade, we can do the chop and the bamboo painting. Okay? So since this is going to be aired and you can stream it, you can turn me off when you get bored, turn me back on when you want to see more of it. If you need to see more of this, you can always zoom in and take a closer look later on.